I don't really have anyone to make this video for, but I don't really have anything else to do either. The subject that's on my mind right now may seem a little dismal if somebody bothers to watch this, but I think it could possibly be productive in assessing my academic situation, for example. As a 61-year-old man, very close, about one class away from completing a bachelor's degree in good standing. It pertains to being born in 1960. And to some extent, being born defeated. What I mean by that is, although my father was a World War II veteran who profited from the um, GI Bill, he didn't stay with our family. But the place, the time was about the time Kennedy was done in, was one of my earliest memories. And The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was on TV, Secret Agent Man. Those were the days, was a popular song. Poor Papa. And the Beatles came in, and it seems strange to me not to be able to sing that way. What place would I have in the world if I can't sing that way? And a few years later, in a different neighborhood after the divorce of my parents, a scientist's son, who himself was on the way to being an important scientist in the community. I was scrawny, getting beaten up a lot, and I asked him something about the meaning of friendship, and he said something to the effect of, nobody wants, why would I want to be friends with you? You don't have anything to offer. And today, 50 years later, I'm in Section 8. I only have medicine because poor people have had medicine legislated to them. And I don't have anything to offer even romantically. I used to be fairly good looking and attractive to women because malpractice has robbed me of um, my passions and energy. So I'm not looking really for a romance of any sort. I can't expect it. I know I can't expect that. I'm trying to avoid being somebody's problem. I don't want to be somebody, martyr somebody to the problems of a 61-year-old deaf poet. I mean, the only reason I went back to school was because the chronic abuse that I was in. They weren't letting me go to school. They said I was a troublemaker and would be a failure and so on. So one might say that sums up a life of meaninglessness. That's what the liberal is, and point to me. But there's another dimension to what happened, the scary fact that I was tortured and it was allowed to happen. And I think being born defeated takes a certain amount of planned parenthood in the sense that our society had come through the 50s. Today, you might question the ability of the inside circle of racists and, you know, warmongers to just do fascist kinds of selections of people to cripple them experimentally for the CIA and laugh about it or something like that. But in the 50s, there was a lot of science fiction movies. And Dr. Strangelove was a good example of the popular psychology. that was giving rise to thinking. Neville shoots on the beach. I've read many of the classics, John Hershey's Hiroshima, and the idea that they wouldn't select a baby for a puppet experiment is silly. I mean, so they wouldn't have thought twice about doing what they didn't think twice about doing what happened to me. So the question of why was it allowed in a city like Pittsburgh, where you have a Board of Public Education and NAACP, has to do with some other, you know, um, pyramid power that was at work in the city's subsections. And I think it had to do with the fact that strategically I wasn't of any use as a scrawny, good looking kid to anybody but people who wanted to make an object less than me, laugh at me, play pornography off of me. Sort of the way that the ANC was spared Nelson Mandela being poisoned to embarrass him. The police in South Africa considered giving him something would make him sort of a drooling old man. And they decided not to. But the Pittsburgh NAACP knew I had been tortured, hit in the head, neurotoxified, made into a joke, a running joke by the Pittsburgh cultural arena. And they laughed. I mean, they didn't have any kind of scruples about it. So, being born defeated took a certain amount of enforcement in that way from a number of different cultural directions. Now, I've looked at the phenomenon of simplicissimus, as one Harvard genius referred to the operation, which is to humiliate somebody. Death before dishonor is a militant French sort of Trumpy tune calling card of the right wing. And the alternative, the Japanese have a tendency to embrace the extreme martial code of death before dishonor. So what they do is dishonor somebody and dishonor somebody. You merely create manufacture simplicissimus to say that's the alternative, is the modern liberal. And all of this involves a good deal of manufacture. If you look at my reading and studying skills, what I would have brought to the table if I could have heard, you might come upon a slightly different opinion. Most things are measured in terms of success by the idea of, cartoon castles in the sky with men like Seal baring their breasts and singing romantic songs, and perfect specimens of all races at the right age engaging in flaming kisses. Other people who've worked very hard at public schools with people of color, colleges that try to expand their curriculum slowly, but being forced largely by student employment interests to concentrate on math skills and reading skills, because there's a lot of students who struggle with even those issues, especially in a society as conflicted as ours. We're having a hard time with COVID. Even before COVID, there were, passions unleashed by popular culture, people's attention going elsewhere. There was some rebellion against the mainstream. There were, causes against war and so forth that at one time was popular because of the draft, and then became less interesting to the mainstream student population when they were no longer in danger of being drafted. And then there were those oil wars and so forth. But in the midst of all of this, there were, people who were writing books. There were good things to read. There were Tolkien. You could read the trilogies. They weren't, you know, um, co- condensed for you into a movie. Read these things, embrace your imagination. And there were songs, some of them which were enriching, or seemed to be at least something other than part of the brainwash. Of course, that's where I was the most disappointed in my life, was to discover that the worst offenders were making the best music. I mean, that's sad and everything, but life is, a learning process, and sometimes you come across things you wish weren't the way they are, but you know, but we do our best. And I remember things that were normal that are gone. It concerns me. We used to have bees. We don't have bees anymore. And the more I've studied it, the more I'm concerned that the bees are being targeted. That somebody who hates the world, hates the human race, blames them for World War II and the tragedies of the past, just decided they want to get rid of the whole thing. And they're just sending as much propaganda as they can on fossil fuels and pesticides in an effort to poison the whole thing and blow the whole thing up. And you don't have to take my word for that. You can do research in the background, the people who tortured me, and see what they really are up to. And you'll find that they, were in a position to brag about violating the Environmental Modification Convention, brag about committing Holocaust simulation experiments, supposedly. I've talked in other videos about what really went on. So being born defeated also meant being born a utility to people who are criminally insane, you know. And it plays out against the background of a sort of cultural heritage of the Fourth Estate, the Frank Church and the church committees investigated things that the CIA had done. And, there were gun lobbying issues that came out in the 80s, like the mysterious deal with Iran to raise money to attack Nicaragua in violation of Congress, which pretended the insurrection on January 6, 2021. Total contempt for the norms of the democracy. And questions about the way that our foundational institutions are either sometimes helpless, as in Seattle's collision with Obama over employment of undocumented workers, and the feeling that we failed the minorities is another issue. But it's a struggle in community schools to get people to focus on the readings and learn the math and so forth. It's not an easy thing to do, but when you succeed, you do succeed. You feel good about that. So people have kept at it. But Seattle doesn't like me. Pittsburgh doesn't really like me. Places I've lived a long time, over, a couple decades in each one. And one of the things is sexual orientation issues. I mean, what does that matter to me? Person's a person. As long as they don't, you make unwanted advances on me, what do I care what their orientation is? But there's sort of demented experimentation going on from the sector that tortured me in the first place. thinking now it's okay to do this to somebody and we should do it some more. And they trot out women who have problems and they say, well, he's similar to somebody who worked me over. What's the similarity? You know, that they worked me over. You know, I mean, it's a dialectical problem of mob appeal. And, you know, they made movies of me when I was a child, selectively cut parts and say, see, he was confused and happy in this one. And then they erased the part where somebody was unknown man was subjecting me to slaughtering fusillades of blows to the head, causing concussions, and kicking me in the forehead and causing huge lumps to my forehead. What they do is they take me out a few weeks later and run a joke by me, or have one of them coming and saying, like with a really nasal expression, remember when we dragged you through glass? And they film this, right, with secret cameras and say, he thinks it's funny. See, he's a masochist. And they put it together at a special laboratory at Carnegie Mellon University called Natural Languages. And they use neurohypnosis and to prove their text that international communications by computers can only get things wrong. That's their thesis, right? They proceed to send a brain scramble through it, get everything wrong, and announce that it's the truth. And this is like the experimental mindset that emerges from the Kennedy assassinations in the city of Pittsburgh. So my point is that being born defeated and ending up a defeated old man in Section 8, alone, without friends, without anybody to even count on to watch something like this, involves some doing on the part of external agencies. And one of the things that they talk about, Joe Biden talks about an objective legal system, the courts being, working and so forth. But I think it's ridiculous. When I went to tell the police I discovered evidence of a crime that wasn't even done to me, they arrested me, put me in a lockup, and started putting me through terror, uh, terroristic reprisals of sorts with medical malpractice and homeless ordeals. How dare you report a crime? Who do you think you are? The police are for the police. They're not for citizens. I went to court and they laughed at me. They were like, you didn't fill out these papers right. What do I care if you've been tortured or threatened or people who you love have been murdered to cause you fear and pain? This is a courthouse. If you don't fill that paper out and know the name of the citation that was violated, you are vexatious. So I dared to report a crime to the police and then became vexatious for asking the courthouse what gives that I was arrested for reporting a crime to the police. So, I don't understand what Joe Biden could possibly be talking about. He seems like a very intelligent, respectable human being. He must know what he's talking about, but I don't know what he's talking about because it seems to me to be patently false. I've tried to follow up on what he says is true and ended up in, some sort of THX 1138 from the finale of Pink Floyd's The Wall. I mean, it's just barking mad brouhaha that doesn't result in anything even remotely intelligent. Nothing you would possibly present to a community college class, much less justice or law or something like that. You'd be as likely to get justice and law from a carjacker. I mean, which is itself is obviously false. I mean, I'm not trying to say some kind of like revolutionary spin on the thing. The carjackers are good. Obviously, that's not true. I'm just saying that, the media of what really happens is absurd. So, you know, I can imagine what sort of that people say about what might motivate me, but I've been alone 30 years. When Jeannie was my best friend, I never made any moves on her. You know, when I was at school, I avoided. I asked one girl if she was interested in me because she seemed to be, and got into trouble for it. But it wasn't because I was getting into trouble. I was concentrating on my studies. My focus at school wasn't girls. And you see, one of the things that they did was really very slick experimentally. Was they castrated me and then said that it proved that they weren't negligent and never in refusing to treat me sign language. Jeannie taught me sign language, and she was attacked and raped to punish her for doing that. So what does that have to do with what? Why would they castrate me? There's no reason. There was no trial. There was nothing. There was no evidence of wrongdoing. There was nothing. It was zero. It was just them, their peeping Tom mentality. They were jealous that girls were interested in me. That was their whole and I was deaf, so I couldn't go to school. They refused to teach me sign language and punished the girl who taught me sign language. And then they castrated me because, in part, that she had taught me sign language. And they knew that if I got free and went to school, I would perform. I made Phi Theta Kappa, made honors. They knew that was bound to happen, that they had been stepping on my face and holding me down. So they had to come up with a story for the explaining my success that was different than that they were neglecting to teach me sign language and that they had deafened me experimentally to keep me out of school. So they castrated me, and they said that's why he's so good at school now. His head is off of his dick. And this was their mentality to justify all of their insane, cruel experiments because it was a pornography. They have pornography films in it. They're licky chops people. They licky chops. They got the pornography. We get cash for these things because we're good. We're police detectives. They're peep, 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 peep. You know, and the quality of people who got involved in this kind of stuff was like Oliver Stone and Clint Eastwood. It was like a Hollywood special operation. Trumpy turns nervous because one of his speechwriters is implicated in the museum theft, and I'm the only person who ever tried to report it. They're accusing me of starting rumors. Well, they caught the dude red-handed who was robbing the museum for $6 million. But he didn't make $6 million robbing the museum by himself. He had a whole network in that culture that includes that kid who said you have nothing to offer. Well, maybe the reason I had nothing to offer was because I wasn't willing to steal anything. So they have things to offer. They have $6 million worth of museum books that they're selling, the hustling to Saudi Arabia and to Israel. And then these rivals of mine who want to kill me experimentally and have me on their Nazi-fied death row in Seattle are people who didn't go deaf, who weren't brutally tortured. And so they're in position. See, Gramsci's war of position is gold for them. They took the girl I left from me, ha, 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 because they had income related to the fact that they were never tortured and deaf. And these kinds of things are an embarrassment to Joe Biden and his coterie. So what do they say? They say, well, you failed to learn how to fill out the forms. I'm not trying to fill out the forms right now. I'm trying to fill in some blanks. You know, it's gotten to the point where I don't even dare say anybody's name for fear that they'll be attacked because they related to me or something. You know, so I don't dare say anybody's name, you know, but this isn't for anybody. I'm just doing this because I don't have anything to do. But don't get it through your head that I'm expecting someone to come, you know, from the wonderful world of Disney and sweep me off my feet as an old man. You know, I have a bottle of Cialis and a picture out of Playboy. I can, you know, ventilate my senescence. But really, there's a lot of trophy issues involved in being an academic that don't pertain to all of the, you know, jiggling wiggles of the parochial fascination system at the NAACP's Licky Chops Psychological Evaluation Committee. There's a lot of important issues out there. You know, it's worth learning to read and do your math. You know, I mean, I'm grateful that at least, you know, even though I was torturing with poison and shouldn't have diabetes, that at least I can afford insulin thanks to a Medicare program. And I'm certainly grateful that Jeannie taught me sign language. I'm sorry I've been separated from her for 20 years. You know, she was my friend, a really, really good friend. But there's no hope against the sort of London intelligentsia that went after the neuroplasm that they themselves impacted experimentally and knew that I didn't know was there. You know, the Japanese shtick of infinite fetish. There's no hope against something like that. They'll manipulate every single um, uh, tweet that comes through my computer. You know, there's no chance of anything like privacy from them. They're criminally insane, but they control the issues. And for them, I was born defeated. I was just, you know, we're heading back into the old 50s sci-fi world where they can, you know, plug your head into a Frankenstein bat. You know, that's how sick um, my tormentors really are. They're really disturbing individuals, really well worth um, avoiding.